The village of Luwanga was a place where time seemed to move at its own slow and steady rhythm, surrounded by vast fields, rolling hills, and a river that whispered stories of the past. It was a land where tradition and history were deeply cherished. In this quiet village lived a young woman named Zahara, whose heart belonged to the stories of those who came before her. She had always been fascinated by history, eager to uncover the forgotten voices hidden within old pages. Zahara worked as the caretaker of the village archives, a small but treasured collection of letters, scrolls and records that held the memories of Luwanga's past. Every day, she carefully dusted the shelves, reading through delicate pages with deep reverence. It was a task she loved, one that made her feel connected to the generations that had walked the land before her. Her grandmother, Mama Kato, often reminded her that some stories are waiting to be found, as if they had a life of their own, longing to be remembered. One evening, as the golden sun dipped behind the hills, Zahara found herself in the dimly lit archive room, sorting through an old wooden chest filled with forgotten documents. As she moved aside a stack of brittle papers, her fingers brushed against something unusual, a small envelope, yellowed with age, tucked beneath the pile as if it had been hidden on purpose. Her heart quickened as she carefully picked it up. The envelope was sealed, but had never been opened. A deep sense of mystery filled her chest as she traced the delicate handwriting on the front. With trembling hands, Zahara broke the seal and unfolded the fragile letter inside. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible, written in an old-fashioned script full of longing and sorrow. The letter began with a simple but heartbreaking line: "To my dearest love, Naima, if only fate had been kinder to us." The name struck something deep within Zahara, though she could not place it. As she read further, she discovered that the letter had been written by a man named Omari, a simple fisherman who had once loved a woman named Naima. Their love had been forbidden, torn apart by the expectations of family and society. Naima, the daughter of the village chief, had been promised to a wealthy merchant, despite her heart belonging to Omari. The letter spoke of a love that had been forced into silence, of nights spent dreaming of a different fate. Omari had written the letter on the eve of Naima's wedding, pouring out his sorrow and undying love, but for some reason, the letter had never reached her. Zahara's fingers tightened around the paper. Had Naima ever known the depth of Omari's love? Had she ever received the message that might have changed everything? She felt a strange pull, as if the story was calling to her, begging to be heard. The letter was more than just ink on paper. It was a forgotten truth, a love story that had been lost to time. And now, after so many years, it had found its way into her hands. The evening was quiet, with only the soft flickering of an oil lamp lighting the small archive room. Zahara sat on the wooden floor, surrounded by stacks of old documents, carefully sorting through them one by one. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust, a smell she had grown to love over the years. She was used to finding forgotten letters and records, but on this particular evening, something unusual caught her eye. As she reached into an old wooden chest, her fingers brushed against something tucked beneath a pile of brittle scrolls. It was an envelope, yellowed with age, its edges slightly curled, as if it had been waiting to be found. Unlike the other documents, this one had never been opened. The seal was still intact, and the handwriting on the front was elegant, written in an old-fashioned script. The ink had faded slightly, but the name on the letter was still clear. Zahara held her breath as she traced the delicate strokes of the name written there. Her heart pounded as she carefully broke the seal and unfolded the fragile paper inside. The words before her seemed to whisper from another time, carrying a weight of emotion that made her chest tighten. The letter began with a single aching sentence: "To my dearest love, Naima, if only fate had been kinder to us." The name Naima sent a shiver down Zahara's spine. She had heard it before, but she couldn't remember where. Who was this Naima, and who was the man who had written this letter? Her hands trembled as she read further. The letter was signed by someone named Omari. The words on the page were filled with sorrow, longing, and an undeniable love that seemed to have been torn apart by something beyond their control. Zahara could feel the pain in each line, as if Omari's heart had been poured onto the very paper she held. He had written this letter long ago, but it had never reached the person it was meant for. Questions swirled in Zahara's mind. Why had this letter been hidden away? Had Naima ever known how deeply Omari had loved her? And if she hadn't, What had happened to her? Zahara felt a strange pull toward the story unfolding before her, as if the letter itself was asking to be remembered. She knew, in that moment, that she couldn't ignore what she had just found. This was more than just an old piece of paper. It was a forgotten love story, waiting to be uncovered. As Zahara continued reading, the words on the fragile paper painted a story of love and heartbreak. Omari, the man who had written the letter, was a simple fisherman. He lived by the river, spending his days casting his nets and watching the sun rise and set over the water. But his heart belonged to Naima, the daughter of the village chief. Their love had blossomed in secret, hidden beneath the shade of the great Baobab tree where they used to meet. In the quiet moments they stole together, they had dreamed of a life where love, not status, decided their fate. But the world they lived in was not kind to love that defied tradition. Naima's family had already planned her future. She was to marry a wealthy merchant, a man chosen not for love, but for power and prosperity. To them, Omari was nothing more than a poor fisherman, unworthy of their daughter. The whispers of the village had already begun. People spoke of Naima's upcoming wedding, of the grand celebration that would soon take place. Yet, hidden from the world, two hearts were breaking. Omari had written this letter on the night before Naima's wedding, pouring his pain and love onto the page. He wrote about how he wished the world had been different, how he wished he had the power to change their fate. He had begged her, in ink, to remember the love they had shared beneath the stars, by the river, where their laughter had once danced with the wind. But the most heartbreaking part of all was that Naima had never seen this letter. Somehow, it had never reached her. Whether it was lost, hidden, or taken away, Zahara did not know. But as she held the letter in her trembling hands, she realized that a love so deep had been buried in silence, never given the chance to be heard. And now, after so many years, she had stumbled upon it. Words of love and sorrow trapped in time, waiting to be found. The letter stayed with Zahara long after she'd read it. She couldn't stop thinking about the words Omari had written, the love that had been lost, and the unanswered questions that now filled her mind. Who had hidden the letter? Had Naima ever known how much Omari had loved her? And what had happened to them both after they were torn apart? Zahara knew she couldn't ignore the mystery. She had spent her life preserving the village's history, and now she had stumbled upon a story that had been forgotten, or perhaps deliberately erased. The next morning, she decided to search for answers. She went to the village elders, the ones who had lived long enough to remember the past. Carefully, she asked if they knew of a woman named Naima or a fisherman named Omari. But each time she brought up the names, she was met with silence. Some elders shook their heads, as if they had no memory of them. Others looked away, their expressions darkening, as if she had spoken of something forbidden. One elder, a frail old man with deep lines on his face, simply muttered, "Some stories are better left buried." Frustrated but not willing to give up, Zahara returned home and spoke to her grandmother, Mama Kato. She hoped that if anyone would tell her the truth, it would be her. But when Zahara mentioned the names, she saw a shadow pass over her grandmother's face. Mama Kato let out a heavy sigh and shook her head. "Leave it alone, my child," she said softly. "Some stories bring pain." Zahara frowned. "But grandmother, this was real. Omari loved Naima. They were separated, and she never got his letter. Don't you think the truth should be known?" Mama Kato's lips pressed into a thin line. "The past cannot be changed, and sometimes remembering only brings sorrow." She turned away, busying herself with a pot of boiling tea, as if the conversation was over. But for Zahara, it wasn't over. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden, that the village held a secret it did not want to share. The raw emotion in Omari's letter still echoed in her heart, and she knew she couldn't simply forget about it. The story was calling to her, and she had no choice but to follow where it led. Zahara could not let the mystery rest. The letter had awakened something inside her, a need to uncover the truth, to piece together a love story that had been lost to time. If no one in the village would speak about Omari and Naima, then she would have to find the answers herself. She spent hours searching through the old village records, flipping through faded pages and worn-out books. Most of the documents were about land ownership, trade agreements, and family lineages, but she was determined to find something, anything, about Omari. Finally, after what felt like endless searching, she came across a brief mention of him. The record confirmed that Omari had lived in Luwanga many years ago, but there was little else. No mention of his family. no details of what had happened to him. Only one line stood out: left for the sea, never seen again. Zahara sat back, staring at the words. Had Omari really left the village forever? Had he sailed away, heartbroken and alone? Or had something else happened to him? There were no clear answers, only rumors that he had gone to sea and never returned. But as she continued digging, she found something even more shocking. In an old burial record, she saw Naima's name. Her heart pounded as she read the details. Naima had died young. The date of her death was only a few years after her forced marriage. Zahara felt a chill run through her. What had happened to her? Had she fallen ill? Had she lived the rest of her life in sorrow? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Omari had vanished, and Naima had died far too soon. The love that had been stolen from them had not only ended their happiness, it seemed to have marked their fates in a way she didn't yet understand. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but Zahara needed to find the missing parts. The truth was close, and she was determined to find it. Zahara refused to give up. The more she uncovered, the more she felt the weight of Naima and Omari's untold story pressing on her heart. Days passed as she continued searching, going through every forgotten corner of the archives, hoping to find something, anything, that could give her more answers. Then, one afternoon, tucked away at the bottom of an old wooden shelf, she found it. It was a small wooden box, covered in dust, its edges worn with time. As she wiped it clean, her breath caught in her throat. Naima's name was carved into the lid. Zahara's hands trembled as she slowly opened it. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded cloth, was a small leather-bound book. She carefully lifted it out, her heart pounding. As she flipped through the pages, she realized what she was holding: Naima's diary. The pages were filled with beautiful handwriting, the ink slightly smudged in places, as if tears had fallen upon them. Zahara's eyes widened as she read Naima's words, each entry revealing a heart heavy with sorrow and longing. She had never stopped loving Omari. Even after she was forced to marry another man, her heart had never belonged to anyone else. One entry stood out, and Zahara felt her chest tighten as she read it. Even in this grand house, my heart still belongs to the fisherman who once held my hand beneath the Baobab tree. Zahara could almost picture it. Naima, sitting in a house she never wanted to be in, longing for a love she was never allowed to have. She had lived in silence, trapped in a life that was never truly hers. Zahara wiped away a tear, realizing that Naima's story had been buried not just in time, but in pain. She closed the diary gently, holding it close to her chest. Now she knew the truth. Naima had loved Omari until her last breath, but Omari had never known. The letter he had written to her had never reached her hands, and the letters she had written in her sorrow had never left this hidden box. Their love had been stolen from them, and Zahara couldn't help but wonder, who had kept them apart, and why? Zahara sat in silence, the weight of Naima's diary heavy in her hands. She now understood the tragic truth. Omari had left the village believing Naima had moved on, when in reality, she had never stopped loving him. He had carried his pain with him, thinking she had forgotten him, while she had spent her final years trapped in sorrow, longing for a love she was never allowed to have. As Zahara turned the fragile pages, she read about Naima's days as the wife of a man she never loved. She had done her duty, had smiled when required, but inside, she had been slowly fading. Her words were filled with heartache, longing for the nights she had spent with Omari beneath the Baobab tree, for the warmth of his hand in hers, for the future they had once dreamed of, but were never given. She had hoped, had prayed, that one day he would return for her. Then, Zahara found something even more heartbreaking. Naima had written letters, so many letters, to Omari. In them, she poured out her love, telling him that she had never forgotten him, that she had been forced into a life she did not choose. She had begged him to come back, to find her, to know that her heart had always belonged to him. But none of those letters had ever reached him. They were still there, hidden in the wooden box, unsent. Zahara's hands clenched as realization dawned upon her. Someone had made sure that Omari and Naima never reunited. Someone had deliberately kept them apart, stolen their chance at happiness, and buried their love story in silence. The thought filled Zahara with anger and sorrow. All those years, Omari had lived without knowing the truth, and Naima had died waiting for a love that never returned. Not because he didn't love her, but because he had never known she was still waiting. Tears blurred Zahara's vision as she gently closed the diary. This wasn't just a sad love story. It was a tragedy that could have been avoided. And now, decades later, she had uncovered the truth, but there was still one thing she needed to know. Who had hidden their letters? Who had stolen their love? And why? Zahara could no longer ignore the feeling that someone in her own family had played a part in this tragic love story. The way Mama Kato had warned her to leave the past alone. The way the elders refused to speak about Naima and Omari, it all made sense now. Someone had deliberately hidden their love, stolen their chance at happiness, and deep in her heart, Zahara knew Mama Kato held the answers. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village settled into the quiet of the night, Zahara sat across from her grandmother. The old woman's hands rested on her lap, her eyes tired yet watchful, as if she knew this conversation was coming. "Grandmother," Zahara said, her voice steady but firm, "you knew about Naima and Omari, didn't you?" Mama Kato let out a slow breath, her gaze drifting to the flickering oil lamp between them. "Some things are better left in the past, child," she murmured. Zahara shook her head. Not this. I found Naima's diary. I found her letters. She wrote to Omari, but he never got them, and I need to know why." For a long moment, Mama Kato said nothing. Then, with a deep sigh, she looked up, her eyes filled with something Zahara had never seen before. Regret. "It was my mother," she finally admitted. "She was the one who stopped the letters." Zahara's breath caught in her throat. Why? Mama Kato's voice was heavy with sorrow as she spoke. "Because she believed she was protecting the family's honor. Naima was a chief's daughter, marrying a fisherman. It would have shamed our family. My mother thought she was doing the right thing. She made sure Naima's letters never left the house. And when Omari wrote, she took his letter and hid it away, never letting Naima see it." Zahara felt a sharp pain in her chest. "So they never had a chance," she whispered. Mama Kato shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. Omari left, believing Naima had moved on. And Naima, she died with a broken heart, never knowing he had loved her until the very end. Zahara wiped at her own tears, overwhelmed by the weight of the truth. She wanted to be angry, to shout that it was unfair, that no one had the right to decide someone else's fate. But what would anger change now? The past had already taken what it wanted. "I wish she hadn't done it," Zahara said softly. Mama Kato nodded. "So do I, child. So do I." Silence filled the room, thick with sorrow. Zahara knew she couldn't change what had happened, but she could make sure that their story was no longer hidden in the shadows. The world needed to know the truth, even if it had come too late. Zahara could not let the story end with sadness. She had uncovered Naima's pain, but there was still one person who needed to know the truth. Omari. She had to find him, to give him the letter he had written all those years ago. The letter that had never reached Naima's hands. She had to let him know that Naima had never stopped loving him. With determination burning in her heart, Zahara set out on a journey to a coastal village where she had heard rumors of an old fisherman named Omari. The road was long, winding through dusty paths and open fields, but she did not stop until she reached the sea. The village was small, the scent of salt and fish heavy in the air. She asked around, speaking to the fishermen, describing the man she was looking for. Some shook their heads, but others nodded, pointing her toward a small hut near the shore. Zahara's heart pounded as she approached the hut, the waves crashing gently behind her. She knocked on the wooden door, and after a few moments, it creaked open. An old man stood before her, his face weathered by time, his eyes filled with stories long forgotten. He was frail, his hands trembling slightly, but there was strength in his gaze. Zahara knew instantly this was Omari. "Who are you, child?" he asked, his voice rough like the sea. Zahara swallowed, her throat tight. "My name is Zahara. I come from Luwanga." At the mention of the village, something flickered in Omari's eyes. Recognition, perhaps even pain. She took a deep breath and pulled out the letter, the one he had written decades ago. "I found this," she said gently. "It's your letter, the one you wrote to Naima." Omari's hands trembled as he reached for it. He held the aged paper carefully, as if afraid it might disappear. Slowly, he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words he had written so long ago. Zahara watched as his expression changed, from confusion to shock, then to something heartbreaking. She never saw this? He whispered. Zahara shook her head. Number it was hidden from her. She never knew you wrote to her. Tears filled Omari's eyes, his lips quivering. He looked up at Zahara, his voice barely above a whisper. Did she forget me? Zahara felt her own tears spill over. She reached into her bag and pulled out Naima's diary. She never forgot you, she said softly. She loved you until the very end. Omari's breath caught in his throat. His hands clutched the letter, and he let out a shaky sob. After all these years, I finally know the truth. He closed his eyes, letting the tears fall freely. Zahara knew that nothing could change the past, but at least now, Omari would no longer have to wonder. He would no longer have to believe he had been forgotten. Love had been stolen from him, but in this moment, it had finally been returned. The morning was quiet, the sky painted in soft hues of gold and pink. As Zahara walked beside Omari through the village of Luwanga, the old man moved slowly, his frail body leaning on a wooden staff, but his eyes were filled with determination. After all these years, he was finally returning to the place where his heart had remained. The village cemetery lay at the edge of Luwanga, shaded by tall trees that whispered in the wind. Zahara guided Omari through the narrow path until they reached the grave that bore Naima's name. The stone was weathered by time, but the name was still clear, etched into history. Omari stood there for a long moment, his fingers tracing the letters as if he could reach through the years and touch the woman he had loved so deeply. His hands trembled as he reached into his satchel and pulled out a single white flower, a delicate hibiscus, Naima's favorite. Slowly, he knelt, placing it gently on the grave. His lips trembled as he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We were always meant to be, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Even if fate kept us apart. Tears ran down his wrinkled cheeks, but there was no bitterness in them, only love, only longing. Zahara watched, her heart aching yet full. She had spent so much time chasing the truth, uncovering the hidden pain of the past, and now she was witnessing the final piece fall into place. Omari had carried this love in his heart for a lifetime, and though he could never change what had been stolen from him, he could finally say goodbye. The wind whispered through the trees as if carrying Naima's spirit, and for the first time, Zahara felt peace settle over the graveyard. The story of Omari and Naima had been buried in silence for too long, but now it was no longer hidden. It was seen. It was known. Omari let out a deep sigh, his shoulders relaxing as he placed a hand over his heart. Thank you, Naima, he whispered, for loving me, even when the world tried to keep us apart. Zahara blinked back tears, knowing she had done what she had set out to do. She had given Omari the truth. She had given him closure, and in doing so, she had honored a love that had defied time itself. When Zahara returned to the village, she knew she could not let Omari and Naima's love be forgotten again. Their story had been buried in silence for too long, hidden away out of fear and shame. But love, true love, deserved to be remembered, not erased. She sat in the village archives, surrounded by old papers and fading ink, and began to write. With each word, she brought Omari and Naima's story back to life, their stolen love, the pain of separation, and the truth that had been lost for so many years. She wrote about Omari's heartbreak, Naima's sorrow, and the letters that had never reached their destination. She poured every emotion onto the pages, determined that their love would never be hidden again. When she was done, she shared the story with the villagers. At first, there was silence. The elders exchanged glances, remembering the past that they had chosen to forget. But then, one by one, they began to speak. They spoke of Naima's beauty, Omari's kindness, and the way their love had defied the rules of society. The whispers of shame that had once surrounded their names faded, replaced by admiration and sorrow for what had been lost. People gathered beneath the great Baobab tree, the very place where Omari and Naima had once met in secret, and read Zahara's words aloud. Mothers told their daughters about a love so strong that even time could not erase it. Fishermen spoke of Omari's unwavering heart, and the village chief himself bowed his head in regret for the past mistakes of his ancestors. No longer was Naima just a forgotten name on a gravestone. And no longer was Omari just an old man lost in sorrow. They became legends, their love now part of Luwanga's history, celebrated instead of hidden. As Zahara watched the villagers embrace the story, she felt a warmth in her heart. Some love stories end in sorrow, but as long as they are remembered, they never truly fade. Omari and Naima's love had found its place in history, and through her words, it would live on forever. As Zahara walked through the village, she felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her heart. She had spent so much time searching for the truth, uncovering the pain of a love that had been stolen by time and circumstance. Now, that love was no longer hidden. It was spoken about, remembered, and honored. She thought about Omari, the old fisherman who had lived his whole life believing he had been forgotten. She thought about Naima, the young woman who had loved deeply, but died with a heart full of sorrow. They had been separated by forces beyond their control, but in the end, their love had found its way back into the world. Even though they had not been together in life, their story had survived, proving that true love never truly fades. As she sat beneath the Baobab tree, the same place where Omari and Naima had once met in secret, Zahara traced her fingers over the pages of the story she had written. She realized then that some stories are not meant to be lost. They wait, hidden in forgotten letters and silent memories, until someone is willing to bring them back to life. Omari and Naima's love had not been fulfilled in the way they had dreamed, but now it lived forever in the hearts of those who knew their story. It was no longer a tale of sadness, but of devotion, strength, and the power of love. And in that moment, Zahara understood something she had never known before. Love, once written, can never truly disappear. It lives on, carried by words, memories, and the people who refuse to let it be forgotten.